Hamas has really done enormous damage to the Palestinian people with their behavior and the vitriolic hatred that they have inspired in many Israelis who did not have it before.
Welcome back, everybody. Today, world-renowned expert on global terrorism, Professor Victor Asal, joins us on the podcast to talk all things Gaza, Hezbollah, Hamas. We get into a bit of a back-and-forth debate about the pro-Palestinian movement, so you're not going to want to miss that. And then he gives his opinion and thoughts for the future of the region. Make sure to like and subscribe. And now I bring you Professor Victor Asal. I mean, there's been a lot of, different analyses as to how decimated. Let's stick with Hezbollah for a minute, then we can go down to Hamas. I mean, do you believe at this point is Hezbollah completely neutered? They sort of been a non-show in the last, flare-up with Iran, which is sort of surprising.
I think they've been damaged a lot. I don't think they've been destroyed. And I think there is every chance that they, depending on where things go in Lebanon, and Lebanon is a very unstable country, as I know you know, I think they could come back to more power in the future, but right now they're pretty damaged, as is Hamas.
Yeah, what's your assessment with Hamas? Because I was just talking to a friend of mine, an Israeli friend of mine, and he essentially said, what I think echoes a majority Israeli position, which is we're not really sure what the government is still doing and what the IDF is still doing in Gaza. I mean, what's your read? Both, let's talk about, the last year and a half, then we can talk about now. I mean, how successful has this war, the post-October 7th Israeli-Hamas war been?
This whole thing is a mess. Okay? What happened on October 7th was completely horrific. And there was Israel wasn't doing anything in Gaza that should have led to this attack. If the attack had come from the West Bank and Yudav Shomron, that might have made more sense. But the leaders of Hamas made the decision to do this attack with the full knowledge that it was going to lead to thousands of deaths. And right now, Israel is in a quandary because this has been going on now for years. And Israel could potentially conquer all of Gaza. But then what do? Because the international community doesn't want Israel to hold on to Yudav Shomron in the West Bank, and doesn't want Israel to hold on to Gaza, and things would get worse for Israel if they actually held on to Gaza. I don't know if you've seen this, but you see there are more and more countries that are demanding a ceasefire with Israel, between Gaza and Israel. On the other hand, the quandary is, if Israel pulls out of Gaza, Hamas might do this again. The other component of the quandary is Hamas still has hostages they have not returned. And I think, there are lots of Israelis who are protesting the government in favor of a ceasefire. I'm sure you're aware of that, yes?
Yeah, of course.
But Hamas is, in some ways, is being foolish, because if Hamas returned all the hostages tomorrow, a huge majority of Israelis would start protesting that Israel needs to stop now. But Hamas is not doing that. And on the other side of things, in some ways, this has been very beneficial for Netanyahu, because it's led him to be able to be more controlling. And he's gotten a lot more support after Hamas did this.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of interesting documentation, and, I'm not a conspiracy theorist on this angle, but the fact that Bibi was sort of allowing Hamas to be propped up. I mean, this is years ago. This is, pre-October 7th. But that was probably based on some failed conception of Hamas actually wanting to sort of normalize and everything there. So I think he just sort of misread the situation. I do. Yeah, go for it.
But I don't think he was responsible for October 7th.
No, of course. People that say that Bibi is responsible for October 7th, that's just sort of ludicrous. It was certainly a failed conception of Hamas, the same way the 1973 Yom Kippur War was just a failed conception of what Egypt was trying to do and everything there. And so I think that's sort of the historic parallel, not the sort of conspiracy theory of, Bibi wanting it or even sort of enabling it. I think that is important to say. I do think, what you just said is something that I don't hear a lot of people talk about when you had mentioned, and it's something I've long agreed with also, which is all Hamas needs to do is release the hostages, and not just the majority of Israelis, but essentially almost all of the sort of moral backing for Israel's current war would sort of dissipate overnight. Like every time, and correct, push back if you disagree, but every time I see some horrific thing that happens in Gaza, and, yes, I do feel bad for innocent people dying in Gaza, like the first thing I think of is, oh my God, if Hamas just returns the hostages, this whole chaos will stop. And, I don't know if there's actually a famine or if there's a myth that there's a famine, but, whatever it is, like that whole thing will just stop overnight if Hamas gives away the hostages. But it seems like Hamas, and, maybe this is where I'll take you to the next question. I mean, this is obviously just a part of Hamas's strategy to try to have as many Palestinians die as possible, because Hamas is playing a much longer game, right? Hamas seems content with letting tens of thousands of people die so that people in the West and around the world and all these other countries are willing to condemn Israel. And so it is a long-term strategy, not a we care about Palestinian lives strategy.
So Dan, have you ever met a person who you just couldn't stand because all they were was about themselves? And if they had to step on other people's fingers and kick them, they would, because they didn't care? Have you ever met
Yes,
anybody like that?
I think so.
You think so? Okay. Hamas are those people. Not the Palestinians. The Palestinians are not those people. But the leadership of Hamas are those people. It's all about their goals. And unfortunately, Netanyahu is a lot like that also. And so it's a very, very difficult situation. Hamas is all about power and making the Israelis suffer. And Netanyahu is all about Netanyahu.
There probably is, there is a strong moral difference there as well. Like Netanyahu certainly is very self-centered, but I don't think Netanyahu is, outright willing to sacrifice as many lives and, as possible. It's very different qualitative differences there.
There's a huge difference. And I'll just get back to October 7th to describe the huge difference. If you're an Israeli soldier and you go into combat and you rape somebody and they find that out, you're going to jail. Okay, that's not allowed. And if you kill a child on purpose, because sometimes children get killed not on purpose, because that's just the way war is. But if you were to kill a child on purpose and that was found out, you'd be in big trouble. But Dan, I know you know October 7th. And the difference is, as much as I don't like Netanyahu, Hamas is much worse. Because what Hamas did on October 7th was not just a war, but a war crime. You know that many people were raped, children were killed on purpose. It was horrendous. And so, yes, I'm not a fan of Netanyahu, but Hamas has really done enormous damage to the Palestinian people with their behavior and the vitriolic hatred that they have inspired in many Israelis who did not have it before.
So I know it's never, people are generally loath to give predictions, but if you had to predict, I'll put you on the spot, how do you think this ends up in terms of the future of Gaza specifically? Is Israel going to try to take it over? Is there going to be some furthering of the Abraham Accords where you think, Saudi or some other country will have some international bloc take control over it? Is this just going to go out with sort of a whimper and Hamas is still going to be in power and we'll be having the same conversation in 2030?
It's really a flip a coin question. Depends on certain things. Depends on how long before Hamas gives up the hostages. Depends on if Netanyahu stays in power. It also depends on if Hamas stays in power. Do you know that there are Palestinians who are very much against Hamas?
Of course. I mean, the Hamas is more brutal against its own protesters than they are against, it's incredibly courageous, the fact that there are Palestinians in Gaza that are willing to speak out against Hamas, given what we know
Right.
about the group. The problem, I don't know how much this affects the situation in the Middle East, but I would guess it does, is that in the West, the sort of pro-Palestinian movement very much conflates the two. And so, I think that's sort of, the pro-Palestinian movement, I think, has done Palestinians in Gaza a huge disservice because on campus, and I'm curious if this is your experience on campus as well, to be pro-Palestinian these days on a campus is to support Hamas, at least, tacitly, but often explicitly.
Well, I don't think that's completely correct. Okay. I think in the same way that a lot of people say anybody who's pro-Israeli supports Netanyahu. Is that true, Dan?
It's not true, but if people had signs saying, King Bibi, we would say that's true. The same way when the encampments have...
Are some pro-Israeli people who support Netanyahu, and there's some pro-Israeli people who can't stand Netanyahu. And I've met a lot of pro-Palestinian people who think Hamas is doing the right thing, but I've also met a bunch of pro-Palestinian people who think what Hamas is doing is really hurting the Palestinian cause. So it really varies.
No, I think there's a separation. I'm curious if you make the separation between generic pro-Palestinian and pro-Palestinian protester / activist. I think that the activist / protest movement, especially on campus, this is definitely my experience. There was a lauding of October 7th. Even, cheers like Globalize the Intifada or River to the Sea, like these are Hamas slogans.
I saw that also, but I also know students who are pro-Palestinian who refuse to go to support October 7th. So it really varies. One of the things I teach my students in my classes about ethnic conflict in Israel and Palestine is I say, never lump an entire group of people into one category. Okay? You want to hate a political party, but don't hate an entire people. Right? And because I'll have students come into my class, let's say when I teach my ethnic conflict class, I have students come in who have no opinion about Israel-Palestine, but I have a bunch of students who come in who are very pro-Israeli and a bunch of students who come in who are very pro-Palestinian. And some of them are flexible about, where they see who the bad guys are, but some of them just hate everybody in the other group. And I work really hard to make them understand hating somebody just because they're part of a group is a big mistake. And I think we need to be more aware of the fact that you shouldn't group everybody under one category just because of their ethnicity. And so being pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli doesn't mean that you're going to support who's leading one or the other.
It shouldn't. And it's not an ethnic thing, right? I think a lot of the protesters in the West were, non-Palestinian, non-Middle Eastern. There was a lot of, white progressives.
Anti-Semites were joining the pro-Palestinian movement. Yes, I've seen that too. But I'm just saying, I don't want to group. I don't want to just put a category that groups everybody into the same category. Okay? So you can be pro-Palestinian without being pro-Hamas. And you can be pro-Israeli without being pro-Netanyahu. Have I seen protesters who are celebrating October 7th? Yes. Have I seen Palestinians and pro-Palestinians protesting the Israeli occupation, but saying that October 7th was wrong? Yes.
I don't see that second being a mass movement. I totally agree with you that the category of pro-Palestinian and the category of pro-Hamas are just different categories. So it would be an error, a category error to sort of conflate the two. But the protests that we've seen, the mass protests, in major cities in Europe and America and on campus.
Supporting the October 7th attack. I'm not disagreeing with you.
Yeah.
And I would like to support that in the same, I would like more people to be supportive of both of those groups without also supporting hate and slaughter.
Totally. What's your, prognostication or diagnosis of the potential for there just being a lot more terrorism inspired in the Western world, Europe and America, given the climate of the last 2 years where there has been sort of a tacit normalization of political violence? I mean, this is both on the right and left in America, but let's, stick with the, left-wing political violence for the moment. Then maybe we can dip into right-wing for a minute. It seems like, I mean, just from everything from now, obviously not every protest, but I've seen, Hezbollah flags pop up in, major cities in America and people backing the Iranian regime. And I've seen Houthi flags. And, if you read these people's charters, I'm sure but just for listeners, I mean, they're not saying we want everyone to be treated equally. I mean, they are calling for explicit violence and death and genocide against Jews. And so, how much do you think this will translate? I mean, I guess what I'm asking is, there's this experience that I'm sure, you've had, but any Jew who's visited, say, I don't know, Barcelona or Paris, you try to go to a, shul for Shabbat, or you try to go to a kosher restaurant and you feel like you're, walking through TSA. There's, 3 or 4 armed guards with every synagogue. And, that's because of the prevalence of anti-Semitic terrorist attacks in places like Paris. Is America sort of heading down that path in the next couple of years?
Rabbi Dan, are you aware of the fact that many synagogues now have security?
I am, but that was always the case. Meaning, growing up, 25 years ago,
there's a lot more security than there used to be, because anti-Semitism has gotten worse in this country, and hatred towards Israel has gotten a lot worse in the last 5 or 6 years, and I think that it's going to continue. And unfortunately, just to be clear, it's not just anti-Semitism that's gotten a lot worse, but Islamophobia in this country has also gotten a lot worse. And so the killing of Jews and Muslims around the world in Western countries has gotten worse. And until leaders work to stop this, until somebody makes an effort towards peace, I don't think this is going to change.
Yeah, I sort of agree that I don't think it's going to change. The tendency to sort of loop anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in the same, and not that you necessarily always do this, but I find it a little bit odd. I mean, I think much of the anti-Israel movement does dabble in anti-Semitism. We can sort of discuss that if you want. I don't see the pro-Israel movement dabbling that much in Islamophobia in America.
Hold on a second. When I say Islamophobia, I'm not talking about the pro-Israel movement. The right wing in the United States and in Europe and in Russia, some of them are pro-Israeli. A lot of them have been adopting some really vitriolic, nasty Islamophobic behavior. So I'm not saying Islamophobia is worse than anti-Semitism, but it has gotten worse. And I don't think it's tied to being pro-Israel. I think it's a general phenomenon in the West. Does that make sense, Dan?
It makes sense a little bit. I do think there is also the flip side in more of the left-wing world, where there's this, get out of jail free card for Islamism, which I've sort of never understood either, where, the fact that, say LGBTQ rights and, the vast majority of the Islamic world are sort of non-existent.
People who are leftists who are very ignorant of what's happening in Islamic states. And they're focused very much on one particular group of people. and Israel.
Yeah.
And there are other people who are more aware of what's happening. So it really depends on their knowledge and their views and their ideology.
Totally. Yeah. So that's what I was saying in terms of Islamophobia. It's sort of, I feel like both the right and the left get this wrong. I think, on the right, they're just afraid of, Muslims because of some, foreign ethnic, thing. And then on the left, the Islamic world can sort of do no wrong. And I've never really understood either of that. But just because I dabble more in, progressive or left-wing circles, I really don't understand this. I mean, it's almost sort of cultural relativism mixed with seeing the Islamic world as, for some reason, minorities, mixed with feeling bad about past American or European colonialism. And, there's been a lot of interesting stuff written about this, about how oftentimes claims of Islamophobia are used to stymie legitimate criticism of Islamic states or much of the Islamic world, which I think is also sort of relevant there. And so, because one trend, and, even Bernard Lewis was writing about this, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago. I mean, in the 20th and 21st century, obviously not the Middle Ages, that's a different story. There obviously has been a trend in the Islamic world towards increasing political violence and terrorism. Now, it's not essentialized, right? So I think people who try to essentialize it, they've never opened up a medieval history book, because obviously if we were talking and this was the year 1000, we'd be like, oh my goodness, the Christian world is political violence and religious violence and everything. In the Islamic world, okay, it's not perfect, but the conversation would be flipped. So I don't think people who want to make an essentialized argument, that's, I think, Islamophobia. But, I guess we can talk about the history of this, but just, what do you think has happened in terms of, why now in the last 30, 40 years has the Islamic world been a lot more fertile ground for movements like this, as opposed to, say, I don't know, the 1600s, where, you didn't oftentimes see groups like this pop up?
I think there were many leaders since the creation of Israel who have seen that as inherently evil and have been pushing jihadi thinking. And there are lots of Muslims who don't accept it, but there are lots of Muslims who have accepted it. And that has become very problematic. I mean, I think that extremism in any religion can do damage, tremendous damage, to other religions, but also to that religion itself. And I've studied extremism, and I've done research on extremism in Islam, in Christianity, and in Judaism. And when you have people in a religion who say everybody who's not part of our religion is evil, you're going to start seeing dead people. And this can be really, really dangerous. And in the same way that not all Jews are like that, not all Christians are like that, not all Muslims are like that, but there have been, the jihadi groups like Hamas have really embraced that.
No, but if you talk to Jews, right, there's between 13 and 15 million, depending on who exactly you count as a Jew, Jews in the world. And if you ask, I would guess you ask your average Jew, what do you think of settler violence or settler, one can call it settler terrorism, Jews that live in Judea and Samaria / the West Bank, going at the Palestinian villages and, sometimes even killing people. I would guess between 95 and 99% of Jews think that that's just abhorrent, condemn it across the board, speak out against it. When they do, polling in Islamic countries, what do you think about, say, attacks? Let's leave Israel aside. What do you think of attacks against infidels, or what do you think of attacks against, LGBTQ people? I mean, these numbers are pretty high. So it's not that they're terrorists, but there has been now, and maybe this is because of Western, pressure, but it does seem like the trends are changing in the wrong direction.
There's I think your numbers for the Jews are wrong. I still think there's a much higher, I don't think it's 97%, like you said, but it's certainly 80%. Okay, does that make sense?
In terms of Jews who would condemn the settler violence.
Yes. But there's a minority, it's not a tiny minority, but there's a minority who would support it. But there's been a lot of efforts among certain people in Islam to push towards the need for the destruction of the state of Israel. And that push towards the need for the destruction of the state of Israel has been happening since the 1930s. And there's a whole bunch of leaders who are still doing it.
But you don't think this goes beyond? I mean, if you think about a group like ISIS, I mean, ISIS didn't love Israel, but Israel wasn't really the center of ISIS's mission, or even groups like Al-Qaeda, right? It's sort of, with this generic anti-Western or wanting to reestablish some, medieval caliphate type thing.
Anti-Western, they also hated the Jews.
Sure, but that's sort of without saying, meaning anti-Semitism is sort of, I think, inherent of any Islamist terrorist group. I assume they're anti-Semitic, but Israel, Israel is the center of, say, Hezbollah or Hamas's or the Houthis' mission statement, versus, ISIS. I'm sure it was some footnote somewhere, but there was a lot more expansive of a goal there.
Organizations that have some tie to either Israel, Palestine, or Lebanon. Well, according to the Palestinians, it's Palestine. So Palestine and Lebanon are much more focused on Israel. And organizations further away from Israel still hate Israel, but their focus is not solely on Israel the same way that Hamas is and other organizations that are related to it.
Sounds great. In thinking about, Iran, because I know you also study nuclear, proliferation there as well, there's still this open question about how much of the Iran nuclear program was actually destroyed. It seems that there were conflicting news sources for about a few weeks, and then I just haven't heard anything about it in the last couple of weeks. So, I mean, what do you know about, what's happened? What do you predict?
So what I know what happened is exactly what you know, because I read it in the newspaper, and I really don't know how much it was damaged. What I am convinced of is that Iran is going to continue to work really, really hard to continue to fix whatever was broken and keep going. And I am very, very concerned for the Iranian people. There are huge amounts of horrible things happening in Iran, not just outside of Iran by the Iranian government, but inside Iran against Iranian civilians. And I really hope something changes soon. But if it doesn't, the current Iran regime, however damaged their nuclear efforts were, they're going to work hard to get it fixed and keep going.
How worried are you about this sort of out of nowhere question, but it's sort of been one of my go-to questions, especially for people in academia. How worried are you about sort of the new anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism, creeping into certain academic fields as sort of just taken for granted, so the conflation of Zionism with colonialism without any nuance there, how much of this is just noise and how much of this is signal?
I think over the last 20 years, there's been a growing, and there are a lot of people who fight against it. And they're not necessarily Zionists, they just, but there's a growing movement to see Israel as a racist colonialist state. Yes. I mean, if you go on Google Scholar, you can find a bunch of articles that can tell you about how awful Israel is.
And is this so I just recorded a podcast with a graduate student in anthropology, and sort of the question that I had for him is, how much does this shake your epistemology in the field? Meaning, I think, there is some conversation to have about, the overlappingness of colonialist tools and Zionism. I think that's a really interesting historic conversation. It's another to make a full-blown, if I read in an academic paper, the, white supremacist, neo-colonialist Zionist state, in my mind, that's just so far from reality. My epistemological certainty for anything that scholar produces, and by extension, if there's enough of these articles in certain journals, the journal, and if there's enough of these journals and the entire field. So, how much does it shake your trust in certain academic fields writ large?
I don't focus on academic fields writ large. I focus on authors. Okay. Um, and one thing I tell my students is, look, you can be against Israel, and think that it's colonial, and think that and I've had students tell me all the Jews need to leave and go back to Europe. And what I say to them is, first of all, more than half the Jews in Israel aren't from Europe. They're from North Africa and in the Middle East, and a lot of them were kicked out. But second, if we decide that everybody's got to leave a country they colonized, where do you think Europe's going to put those 240 million Americans who are going to have to leave? Because a huge majority of the world, North America, South America, the Middle East, right? Where did, a lot of it came out of Arabia. Much of the world has been colonized. And when you focus only on one or two groups, right? And I've had arguments with people who say, the Palestinians are colonists. I say, no, you can't judge somebody just by who they are in terms of that. Do you think we should expel everybody but Native Americans from the United States?
No, of course not.
Okay. You think we should expel all Arabs from Israel?
No, of course not as well.
Okay. So do you see where, if you say we should destroy this country because they came from someplace else, I find that highly problematic. I don't think it's realistic.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's sort of, I guess, what we were talking about, 20 minutes ago with much of the pro-Palestinian movement, at least in the West, where, and I think certain scholarship is going down this route also, they're just not really engaging in the real world of the Middle East, where there's, people and governments, and, it's all this sort of abstraction of Zionism is colonialism bad, colonialism needs to be destroyed, even if that means violence, but it's all sort of happening in academic classrooms and, the ivory tower metaphor, as opposed to people actually sitting down trying to figure out, okay, what is some genuine policy to try to actually push for something to change? Because, in my mind, and, I just got off the phone with a friend from Israel, and he said that, that he's becoming, more left-wing because he's looking at what the government in Israel is doing, and he's saying there doesn't seem to be any plan. But then he said, but listen, when the alternative is in the West, you hear people talk about the destruction of Israel. He's like, well, if you have to choose between Bibi and Israel being destroyed, which is a false choice, but it's the choice that a lot of Israelis sort of feel, obviously you're going to choose sort of Bibi every time, as opposed to if sort of a moderate faction arose. I mean, I think that the pro-Palestinian world lost a major chance post-October 7th to sort of change the paradigm in the Middle East, meaning if you would have seen pro-Palestinian groups after October 7th come out and condemn unequivocally October 7th, and then subsequently say, listen, acts like October 7th and the, high rates of support for Hamas in, the West Bank and maybe even Gaza, they don't come out of a vacuum. They come because conditions are awful. There's no professional or economic prospects. And so October 7th, terrible. We deplore this. And also, we need to change the paradigm. Like, the Middle East could have looked very differently now in terms of future for the Palestinians. It seems like now, I mean, I don't think there's any point of our lives where we were further away from having a Palestinian state or, Palestinian prosperity than we are right now. And so it just sort of seemed like a huge missed opportunity there.
I agree. I'd say it's one of the worst things that has happened between Israel and Palestine since the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, because that was devastating. It really had a huge impact on the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations and Israeli politics. But I really, really hope, I really, really hope that sometime in the near future, The Palestinians get a leadership that really actually wants peace. And the Israelis get a leadership that actually wants peace. And for peace to actually happen, both the Israelis and the Palestinians both need to have leaders who want peace. And until that happens, this awful stuff is going to continue to keep happening.
Yeah, I think sadly I agree. We've been talking for a while. Is there anything else that we didn't touch, or any other, angles that you want to cover in the conversation?
I really, really hope that good leadership arises on both sides. And I think it has been October 7th was in some ways a huge mistake for Hamas. And maybe Hamas doesn't see it that way, but more and more Palestinians see it that way. It had a huge effect on a lot of Israelis' political perspective in a negative way. And we need leaders on both sides who are going to push really, really hard we need to come up with a deal that's going to work for both sides. And until that happens, you're going to continue to have violence.
Yeah. Well, Professor Victor Asal, thank you so much.
You're welcome. I hope this was not too boring.
No. This was great. We really appreciate it.